We would greatly appreciate if you can take about 5 to 10 minutes to complete this after the webinar is over. Please help us ensure that we are providing high-quality training and technical assistance by completing this short evaluation. In the Q&A box, please feel free to ask your questions to our presenters. In the bottom right-hand corner, feel free to participate in conversation with everybody else. Hope you enjoy this webinar.
Thank you, Sylvie, and a welcome as well. This is Kim Osmani, and we're really excited to have all of you joining us this afternoon to talk about supporting and serving youth with significant disabilities. There are over 368 people registered for this webinar, and we just keep seeing the participant number increasing and increasing as who's logged in. So we will have a very large audience today, and we're really excited about that. Before we jump into moving through the slides, I just want to kind of give a little bit of a background and set the foundation for the webinar today that Michael and I will be presenting. As most of you who are from the field of education know, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, does have language in it that requires transition services to be provided to students with disabilities. Excuse me. The law requires that it begin at least by the age of 16, if not before. Yet we're still seeing that transition services in some places across the nation aren't up to par. And there are approximately 150,000 to 200,000 students with disabilities that age out of school, which means that they've reached that maximum age of eligibility, which is 21 or 22, depending on the state. Some states actually can go to 26, but we won't get into that today. The webinar content today is really going to talk about that population, the population of vulnerable youth who tend to stay in school until they've reached that maximum age of eligibility. The population of students who might possibly fall under Section 511 of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which means that maybe one day they would voice that they want to pursue employment at sub-minimum wage. This is a really critical population that we all need to circle around and help provide opportunities to. So without going further into the meat of today, I want to introduce myself to you and my partner as well for today. As I said, my name is Kim Osmani, and I am a technical assistance liaison with the Voc Rehab Youth Technical Assistance Center that is housed out of the Institute for Educational Leadership in Washington, D.C. My background is in not only special education as a special education teacher and working at the state level in special education, but also as a statewide transition coordinator for VR agency for 9 years. And my co-presenter today, Michael.
Yes, hi, I'm Michael Storr, and I work for the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, or NTAC, and I'm a Knowledge Development and Technical Assistance Specialist working with states, primarily looking at interagency collaborations and how to ensure that effective transition practices are happening in their states. My background, I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and worked for 15 years as a coordinator for secondary transition services in the states, but prior to that, for 11 years, I was a transition coordinator working with students with significant complex needs in transition. So welcome, and really excited about presenting this information today.
Thank you, Michael. Michael and I are from two of the centers that are represented on this slide. I'm from YTAC and he's from NTAC, but there are 3 other national centers that focus on youth with disabilities. You have WINTAC, which is the Workforce Innovation National Technical Assistance Center, that focuses a lot on laws, policies, and regulations related to WIOA. Then you have the PROMISE Technical Assistance Center, which focuses on students and youth who are receiving Social Security benefits and assisting them and their families in achieving employment. And finally, you have the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability, which really emphasizes employment and youth development. And as I was saying before, the Voc Rehab Youth Technical Assistance Center, we are part of the Institute for Educational Leadership out of Washington, D.C. And that one really was formed out of the work of 3 centers to address some pieces of helping youth development. One is making that connection between the community and public education. Another is identifying and creating and building those pathways to employment. And finally, preparing generations and building and developing future leaders. The Voc Rehab Youth Technical Assistance Center, or YTAC as we call it, is funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Rehab Services Administration. It is a technical assistance center whose responsibility is to work with the state vocational rehabilitation agencies in serving youth, service professionals, specifically for students and youth with disabilities. A large emphasis is on re-engaging some students and youth who may be disengaged. For example, you might be looking at students in juvenile justice, you may be looking at youth with disabilities who have dropped out, youth in foster care, etc. Or another term that we like to focus on is opportunity youth. So we're really looking at ways that we can get those youth engaged with the VR system to help them achieve positive post-school outcomes. Now, Michael's going to tell you a little bit about NTACT.
So NTACT, sorry about that. Let me go back. NTACT, likewise, is funded in part from the RSA, or the Rehab Services Administration, but also through the Office of Special Education Services federally, or OSEP. So we are jointly funded. And we are really set up as a center to help state education agencies as well as VR agencies and their local counterparts of the school districts and the VR offices to support youth, young adults, and their families in the secondary transition process. We're really designed, as it says on the slide, to implement effective practices and promising practices that include ensuring that students with disabilities, including those with significant disabilities, are prepared to graduate successfully to post-secondary goals of further training, employment, and to live independently in their communities. I want to move on next and talk a little bit about the objectives for today's webinar. And Kim alluded to these in her introduction, but we really are looking at 3 primary outcomes that we'd like to have achieved at the end of today's webinar. One is to provide some information to you all regarding evidence research-based practices regarding secondary transition services for youth and students with complex needs. Also looking at and having a discussion regarding the barriers that often are faced in looking at transition services for students with complex needs, but I think also then looking at solutions to those barriers in implementing programs. And then lastly, really discussing the importance of collaboration of teams, interagency teams working together in order to have successful transition outcomes, again, for students with complex needs. So our agenda for today, hang on one second. We really are looking at, first of all, a definition of who are the students and youth that we are talking about. Then taking some time to look at barriers to successful transition. Then looking at desired outcomes for students with complex needs. We'll take some time and look at the legal requirements for supporting students in transition, those that have complex needs. Have a discussion regarding secondary transition planning. And then lastly, looking at current effective practices regarding the support of students with complex needs, again, as they move into life after high school, graduating for further training, employment, and independent living. So we want to start first, and this is really a question for you all to think about. We'd like to know what you think. So who do you think are students and youth with the most complex needs? And we'd like you to enter that information into the chat box now. So take a minute or two, type into the chat box, who do you think are students with and youth with the most complex needs? And we'll give folks a minute or two to go ahead and type that in. Okay, and as I'm looking, glancing through what folks are typing in, what I'm noticing is it really is an array of different definitions of what you as one of our participants in today's webinar consider a youth, a student with complex needs. And I think that often comes back to your perspective, whether you are working in education, special education, working in the VR system, or are one of the community agency partners, or perhaps you're a family member, in what your view is. And what we'd like to do now is to go in and look at a couple of perspectives of defining who are the youth students with the most complex needs. So on the next slide, we are going to look at this definition from the VR perspective. And this was talking with a number of folks in the VR system and what they decided, or what their definition of a youth with a complex need was. So in looking at this, all of these are specific to students with complex needs in a work situation. So things such as ensuring that there is a line of sight supervision for that student on a work site, looking at needs regarding communication and the individual being able to fully participate in the employment activity, looking at the development of individualized supports regarding behavior concerns, considering any risks or safety issues, looking at students that have specific medical needs, as well as looking at strategies to assist with crisis management. That is somewhat different, though, than we look at the education perspective regarding who are the students with the most complex needs. When think about students in the education system, and again, utilizing that terminology, most complex needs, we're really looking at students that need one-to-one assistance for all activities of daily living. They're limited in their physical or mental stamina. They oftentimes may have significant behavior issues. They're limited in communication, to someone that is, their communication is down to a eye gaze to answer yes/no questions. They require supports daily from medically trained professionals, and also supports, one-to-one supports for social engagement activities. So when we kind of summarize all that and we look at the next slide, we really look at students with complex needs, demonstrating a diverse set of skills, strengths, limits, and supports. And I really liked all the information you all were typing into the chat box, because I think that demonstrates that this is a diverse group, but it's also that group of students that really do need the most support from not only their families, but professionals in the field. That they oftentimes have multiple impairments that in fact impact their ability to be successful, both in the education setting, but more importantly, once they graduate and go on for further training, employment, and living independently in the community. And the supports are usually pervasive and extensive that they need in order to be successful. With that, and just kind of having that in mind, that definition of who are we talking about, I'm going to pass this on to Kim to talk a little bit about the barriers that we have seen from talking to folks around the country that they see in supporting students with complex needs in employment.
Thank you, Michael. And Sylvie, if you could pop up the first poll question. What we'd like to do now is put it back in your seat and ask all of you, what are the top barriers that you encounter when you're trying to support students with complex needs in achieving an employment outcome? And everybody will be able to see the overall responses here in this poll. So we'll give you all a few minutes to choose your response. And I know you may want to be able to choose more than one, but you can't. You can only choose one. So choose the one that has probably been the biggest barrier for you. So far, it looks like transportation is in the lead, followed by communication issues, and now things are shifting just a little. And it's going to be really interesting to see how these responses play out because we have such a wide variety of different people on this webinar, everything from voc rehab counselors, teachers, parents, those that provide pre-employment transition services. There's school psychologists on here, commissioners, family education specialists, lots of a variety of backgrounds, but transportation is still in the lead. So we'll give it another maybe 5 seconds or so. Looks like, how many votes do we have in? 30, 40, 50, 60, maybe about half of you have responded so far. But it looks like what it's boiling down to is transportation is probably one of the #1 barriers to helping our individuals achieve an employment outcome, then followed by communication issues, community opportunities, so, open doors and things available in the community. And interesting to see lack of expectations as something that's pulled up there. That was coming up the 3rd highest. Oh, okay, we're getting more and more. Transportation is still in the lead in communication. We have done a similar presentation at the NTAC Capacity Building Institute where we actually had teams, Michael and I had teams working together in groups, and we asked them to just kind of popcorn style share with us what the barriers were that they faced. And many of the barriers you're seeing presented in this poll are the barriers that they mentioned as well. And what we're going to do is just talk a little bit about these barriers and how we can approach them. So Sylvia, if you can move the poll over to the right. These are listed as barriers, but in essence, many of them are just obstacles that we can try and find ways to overcome or break through. There may be instances where something truly is a barrier and we can't break through it, and it's something that's just going to be a deal breaker. But in many cases, they're just mere obstacles. And we really need to consider, how can we break through these obstacles? Part of it is, educating business owners, educating families, having school staff being more well-versed in transition and in the services and supports that are out there. Having VR, more at the table at the schools and partnering from, early on. So part of an education and training and ensuring that all of the youth service professionals that are providing supports and services to youth with the most significant disabilities have an arsenal of resources, strategies, experts, people they can go ask questions of so that they can help support these individuals. In demonstration, I think seeing is believing, and I think in certain times there are individuals who may surprise us. And the way that some individuals act in a classroom where we expect them to, sit in their desks, do their work, be quiet, whatever the expectations are from classroom to classroom, is different than how we would expect an individual to function outside of a classroom. And oftentimes when given that opportunity to demonstrate their skills and abilities outside of the classroom, in a work environment, in a social environment, in a volunteer environment, we may see very different behaviors for the positive. And I can attest to a summer program once where it was a student with pretty significant disabilities. She was participating in a summer work program, and her placement was at a local movie theater. And she was part of what I call the SWAT team that would circle in after a movie and go in and clean that whole theater. And I'll never forget, at the celebration at the end of the summer, her mom stood up and just said that she couldn't believe that her daughter was capable of doing the things that she heard about and witnessed her doing on that job, because she had never had an expectation of her doing any chores at home either. So she'd never been able to demonstrate and to model to her mother the skills that she could acquire and transfer into an employment situation. And to go back to kind of the responses in the poll and seeing that some people really did identify that low expectation, whether it's low expectation on behalf of a teacher, a VR counselor, a business owner, or parent. You know, there's a lot of education and training and demonstrating that can take place to truly change the opinion that we may have of individuals with significant disabilities. Let me move on, sorry, and I didn't move the screen. Some of the other barriers that were looked at and mentioned, being able to assess the needs of an individual with significant disabilities and looking at the wide range of transition assessments and other ways of truly assessing their needs, their strengths, their preferences. Communication was definitely something that was similar to what you all responded to in the poll. The lack of knowledge and opportunities on behalf of employers opening their doors in the community. The environments maybe not being accessible, that might be an issue as well, and so on and so forth. So you see several that are very similar to what you all responded to in the slide, or in the poll. The next slide also is continuing with more barriers. You know, there may be some, and I saw when we did the poll of what do you view as a student or a youth with the most significant disabilities, and I saw some that said yes, someone who's going to require one-to-one assistance, or someone who has medical needs or needs, you know, 24-hour care, or you know, we don't have transportation, whatever it is. These are additional barriers that are often listed. And when we look at these, some people may say, how in the world is this person going to be able to work in the community? In addition to having these needs, also encountering these barriers. And a lot of it is based on looking at the supports that are available and being aware and cross-training and making sure that we're connecting with our local resources and that the local DD staff know what the local VR staff are doing and who the players are and come together on a regular basis. Another part of it too is advocacy. Parents and individuals with disabilities play a large part in advocacy and in affecting change in their local areas, in their state, and in the nation. And I believe, strongly believe, that parents can absolutely play a huge role in that. The one that refers to small n, or it's not a big enough issue, may, and I'm sure many of you experience this barrier, that you may have an individual who might be the only individual with the most significant disability in your town. Therefore, it's not on anybody's radar to make any significant changes to accommodate this person in an employment situation in the community, or even in school for that matter. And that's where advocacy absolutely can play a role. And so it's really looking at how can we affect change in these areas to overcome these obstacles so that they're not barriers, but they're just an obstacle that we have to work our way through. And this leads us to the core belief that everybody has the right to a good life. I mean, I want that for myself. I want it for my children. And when I was a teacher, I certainly wanted that for my students. Some of the resources that we're going to be talking about here, or the tools or processes coming up, are based on the framework of the life course framework out of Missouri. And there are tools that were developed by families and individuals with disabilities for families and individuals with disabilities. A good life. That sounds good, right? I bet if I was sitting there with all of you, all would be shaking your head. Yes, that is good. But what might be missing? Is there anything missing? Read that belief. All people and their families have the right to live, love, work, play, and pursue their life aspirations in their community. Who could argue with that? So what we're going to look at now are tools that could possibly help us in supporting individuals with significant disabilities in achieving their goals. And I want you to think seriously about these questions. The first one is, what is it that we are actually doing to support this student or youth? And if you have a student or youth in mind that you've been working with or have in the past, keep them in mind as you ask yourself these questions. What are we doing to support them? And then the next question builds on that and goes really deep. Is it meaningful? And then, will it really help the student to achieve his or her post-secondary goals and to enjoy a quality of life? We all do a variety of things. We implement different strategies and procedures. We provide various opportunities. We have partners and mentors and the whole gamut. But ultimately, do we really look at what the benefit is for that individual in helping them achieve the goals that they set out to achieve? If you're a special education teacher, you're a speech pathologist, whomever it is, and you're writing the IEPs for students with disabilities, and you're writing that transition section, look at the depth of what is in there in terms of the annual transition goals or the coordinated set of activities. Is it meaningful, and what's it doing to help them prepare for life after high school? And I just use that as an example, but for everybody who's on this webinar, to really think about those three questions. And I would encourage you to share those three questions with the other people that you work with. Families, share them with other families. Really ask those questions, because that's at the core of identifying strategies for helping to support individuals in becoming successful. So we're going to pull in our last poll for the day, for this webinar, the last poll, to ask you another question about current practices. So this question is, are current transition practices of you and your colleagues meeting the needs of students with the most significant disabilities? So we're asking you to really think about the strategies and practices that you all implement. And is it really meeting the needs of students with the most significant disabilities? We'll give you just a little bit of time to respond to that. Right now, it's 92%, 93% no, about 8% yes. And I would say that if we were to ask you why, we'd probably hear things like, maybe it's the minority, so it's not on anybody's radar. There's no funding, can't get administrative support. There's no opportunities in our local area. We don't have paraprofessionals or job coaches or something that can go, out in the community with them. So I'm hoping that I'm hitting on some of the things that we would hear of the reasons why you don't think that what you're doing is really meeting the needs of students. So then I'm going to throw that next question out there to you, and it's a food for thought. Then what can we do differently? What can we do differently? And I hope that you can walk away from this and keep asking yourself, what can we do differently? And I see Colleen, yes, low expectations, that is definitely one. And I hear that, like I said, that parent didn't necessarily have those expectations of her daughter. But very easily I've seen it flip to where a teacher's expectations for a specific student is that they're just going to go into a sheltered work environment. And so it's all about that educating, training, and demonstrating. Excuse me. So yeah, we've got about 87 responses, and we're still at about a 91, 92% of no. So Sylvie, thank you for pulling that poll in, and I appreciate the input of those of you that are typing into the chat. So again, is it meaningful, and what can we do differently? So let's talk a little bit about post-secondary goals for individuals with the most significant disabilities. And it reaches that expectations piece that has been mentioned here several times now throughout the webinar, that we've even seen in the chat. The post-secondary goals should reflect high but realistic expectations. And I know that might seem like a contradictory thing, but you get what I'm saying. They need to be high. We need to be looking from an employment-first philosophy, and yes, Kathleen, absolutely. And I equate it to like the least restrictive environment in special education. You know, we wouldn't want to automatically just take a student and have them be completely secluded in special education for an entire day. We want them to be included as much as possible into the general education environment, and then work backwards as we need to. So let's think of it that way. Their goals should reflect a forward movement instead of a dead-end approach. And what we've heard in conversations is that, you know, we might just look at, well, they're just going to sit at home. They're just going to be in a day facility. But let's look at the goals. Let's look at a growth in that goal and the things that they can do and build upon each year. And these are transition youth, for crying out loud, right? So they're going to change. They're going to change as they get older, as their interests change, as their friends change, as what they see on TV changes. And so expect those goals to change over the years, or even 10 times in 1 year. And then, of course, they can be mixed, considering the student's stamina, their endurance, their ability level, incorporating those external supports, those resources in your community, those agencies and other entities that can be supporting them in their coordinated activities and employment. And at first, maybe it's not so specific, but maybe it's going to increase in detail as they approach graduation, as they hone in more on what it is that they're truly interested in doing. And maybe they've been doing transition assessments, and maybe they've been doing job shadows or using ONET and watching videos of different kinds of jobs and have really honed in on, I really think this is what I want to do. And that goal can become much more specific. Maybe they don't know where they want to live when they're done, but maybe that's going to solidify by the time they're reaching the time that they're leaving high school. And again, like I said, it can change from year to year, sometimes a little bit, sometimes completely light years from where they were before. And that's transition. That is transition in a nutshell. It's an experiential developmental process for youth to figure out what it is that they're going to do with their future. And opportunities and experiences we can provide help them to hone in on that. Excuse me. I'd like to give this example of my own daughter, who's 10, and just looking at, you know, when you talk to elementary students and you say, what do you want to be when you grow up? You hear everything from firefighter, police officer, you know, NBA player, I don't know. Hers has gone from princess to dancer to baker to a music teacher. So we're even seeing a progression in all of that. And all of that is framed around what she's involved in and exposed to in the activities that she has done through music and dance, or at home in cooking and baking. And so, you know, she's a 10-year-old kid. She's going to be growing and changing, all youth too. So let's get a little bit more intense, and let's look at some of the legal considerations that affect the work that we all do. One is, I mentioned it before, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, the Rehabilitation Act as is amended by the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, the Employment First Initiative, and then the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. These are 4 key areas that definitely impact what we have to do, the services that must be provided, to what extent, to which individuals, and what the ultimate goal is. And something they all have in common is a shared responsibility in this effort, and not that it's just one person's responsibility. Everybody has to be part of that solution, including the family, including the individual with disabilities. We can't be, you know, there's nothing, nothing about me without me. I mean, that's a huge advocacy piece right there, is let's hear from the individual. What are their interests? What are their needs? What are their dislikes? Let's hear from the family. What do they see at home? What do they see in the community? How does this individual interact with, you know, peers? And what do you see? How do you see their interests evolving? And what do you see for them? So we have a huge task here to make sure we're all on the same page. And when we have education at the table with VR or with developmental disabilities, we all have to be on that same page, and we all have to be looking at the outcome of competitive integrated employment. And looking outside the box, I see Deidre's comment about VR counselors need to write IPEs that are not just for food and cleaning jobs. And I get that, you know, the food, filth, fauna, flora areas that we tend to see for individuals with disabilities, yes. And I don't want to say that that's a generic statement that all counselors do that, but you know, just like we see some generic IEPs, we see some generic IPEs. And how can we get away from that? We can get away from that by truly doing assessments and tapping into what the interests are of that individual and how it evolves over time. We can, in the Rehab Act, it allows a projected vocational goal. That why do you think that when WIOA came out, they added that in? Because for transition age youth, that's going to evolve over time. And so they know that it's going to change. They're saying, you know, point blank, you can have amendments to the IPE for that goal. So one of the things that came out of the Rehabilitation Act of NWIOA is this concept of pre-employment transition services, where voc rehab agencies have to reserve 15% of their funds to provide pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities and to potentially eligible students with disabilities. Another thing that came out of that is Section 511, which addresses going to work for sub-minimum wage, and that is anything that is lower than minimum wage. There's federal minimum wage, but then some states have their own state minimum wage, which may be even higher than the federal minimum wage. And these two things, the pre-employment transition services and Section 511, sub-minimum wage, those two intertwine very tightly when you're talking about individuals, students specifically, with the most significant disabilities. Because what ends up happening is we need to have that shared responsibility. We need to have that goal of competitive and integrated employment. They need to be building education and training credentials. And if there is an individual, and in some states, you know, they don't even allow sub-minimum wage employment, there has to be a process where the student is receiving transition services under IDEA if they're on an IEP, pre-employment transition services on their IPE through vocational rehabilitation. Those two things need to come together and result in documentation that that student has completed these types of activities to help prepare them for employment. That documentation is critical if they're going to be pursuing sub-minimum wage employment. And so you can see how tightly education and VR must collaborate to ensure that the proper documentation is in place and that we're not waiting until the last semester of their senior year to start implementing transition activities. This has to be going on earlier. Collaboration has to start sooner so that there isn't a delay upon leaving high school. Lots of focus in all of these about being fully integrated into the community and about having meaningful work experiences. And I just want to remind you, if you have any questions, you can absolutely type them in the Q&A box or in the chat, either way. So please, you know, feel free to ask questions as we go. If there's something that you don't understand or want clarification on, we are happy to address that for you. I'm going to move on to the next slide that talks about the Employment First movement, which essentially, if you look at the purple text, employment in the general workforce is the first and preferred outcome in the provision of publicly funded services for all working-age citizens with disabilities, regardless of level of disability. So really focusing on that competitive integrated employment in the community should be our first goal. And as you can see, there are about 49 states who have had some type of effort around Employment First. However, there are only 33 that have any kind of official state policy that state that they're going to look at employment in the community as the first and preferred option for people with disabilities. You can find more information about this at the State Employment Leadership Network, and the link is in the slide. And just to remind you, if you came on after the introduction, Kind of in the middle of your screen, it says download materials, and you can download the PowerPoint for today's webinar, as well as I believe you can download the transcript. In everyday language, essentially what Employment First is that we have that belief that everyone wants to work can work, and if they have the right supports and opportunities, that they can actually be successful in those settings. It may come down to natural supports. It may be supports by a job coach or some other type of support, but employment must be what's considered first, especially to look at the least restrictive environment. So I'd love to equate it to that special ed world of LRE. In some states, they have class action lawsuits that prevent sub-minimum wage employment. And advocacy is what ultimately, I believe, has helped push the Employment First philosophy. When we talk a little bit more about integration, in the previous slide I talked a little about integration into the community, goes along with the LRE. Look at the things that you're seeing pop up now across the nation. Everything from accessible parks that are opening in various places. You see different groups forming clubs, sports teams, and organizations that are outside of Special Olympics. So we're seeing a lot more of attention being paid to fully integrating individuals with disabilities into the community. And I think it's a conscious effort to make that happen. Robin mentions they need to be given the same opportunities as individuals without disabilities. Absolutely. And that's what special education and vocational rehabilitation and Employment First is all about, is those same opportunities. So going into the final rule for the home and community-based services, excuse me, effective in March of 2014, the rules here stated that states must meet their federal standards within 5 years. So by March of 2019, they must meet these standards, which include providing person-centered plans of care, doing things that are integrated in the community, not just in-home, and looking at the services and supports that individuals need to be successful and integrated into their community. Person-centered planning is also in WIOA. There's a requirement that the vocational rehabilitation counselors be invited to those person-centered planning meetings. So if you are someone who sets those meetings up and you run those meetings, please reach out to the vocational rehabilitation office near you and get that partnership going. This is a huge emphasis on collaboration, just like we have seen previously, and that given that full access to the community. And I think what you'll see across those 4 laws is that just the least restrictive environment. I mean, that is truly what we're seeing. It's equal access and to the greatest extent possible that it can be in the community. There is a comment that I can't see all of. I see it says, the comment is well taken. We do have to remember that employers will hire who they want. As hard as that is to accept, we have to help create a compelling vision for this. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's when I talked about that education, training, and demonstration pieces are truly what can help that happen. And would love for people to chime in the chat if you want to help respond to that on how do you work with employers to help support your individuals with disabilities in achieving employment without it looking like a charity case. How do you sell the strengths of that individual? How do you help that individual shine and show their strengths and what they can do and how they can be an asset to that business. So if you want, feel free to please add that to the chat. Robbie asks, will vocational rehabilitation end IEP meetings? Absolutely. They have to be invited. That's in the law clearly, is that they will try to attend when invited. And there's a lot that goes into that, and I can't speak for every voc rehab counselor across the nation and how they do it, because everybody's different. But given enough notice, and depending on their caseload and distance from you, absolutely, definitely invite them to your meetings. So this next slide, get to it here. When we talk about community participation supports, when we all come together, ultimately, what is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to increase the potential for employment. We want to develop and ensure that we are sustaining a range of valued social roles and relationships. We want to build in those natural supports in the workplace, because the more independent they can be and fade from those other like one-on-one supports, the more independent and prideful they will be. And, there's so much literature out there about, increasing mental health and physical health that goes along with that. And then ultimately experiencing meaningful community participation and inclusion. So here's what I like to throw out now is this is where you get into the who will do it. What will they do? When will they do it? Where will they do it? How will they do it? And why? Why should we be doing that? Why should we be collaborating? And we know the why. It's figuring out the who, what, when, where, and how to make those things happen. And so I challenge you to go back after this webinar and really look at who, what, when, where, and how, and make a plan, make it happen. We're talking about equal rights, we're talking about equal access, and we're talking about thinking beyond the school doors. It's not just about getting individuals with significant disabilities to be graduated or to even age out. But I'm going to ask you this one question. What happens the day after? What happens that day they wake up after high school graduation or their last day of school? What are they going to do? What are our students with disabilities going to do? So on that note, I am going to turn it over to Michael to talk about some secondary transition planning.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kim. So this next section, and it's going to start with this section regarding secondary transition planning, is also then going to lead us into talking about what are some evidence-based effective practices in looking at supporting students with complex needs and being successful with their post-secondary goals. This slide is really looking at, for all students that have an IEP that are of transition age, and I know that varies depending on the state you're in. The federal law, IDEA, requires that all students by the age of 16 are engaged in secondary transition planning, but a lot of our states start transition planning at age 14. But I think this chart does a nice job of looking at all the components of what should be happening in the education setting to support students, and it's really regardless of their disability. So this would be for students with really complex support needs, as well as students that have more of those disabilities that are high incidence, such as a learning disability. But it starts, if you look at the top of this flow chart, with looking at age-appropriate transition assessments. And that's really crucial in supporting a youth in this transition process. It's looking at what their current needs are, as well as their strengths, and then looking at this second part that's really their interests and preferences. And again, really looking at, for that young person, what is it that they want to do? What are their expectations for when they leave school? And where are they now? What supports they need in order to reach those goals? What type of assistive technology can be provided to support them? What type of accommodations can be made to support them? Based on that information, based on their interests and preferences, and where that student is functioning. That really then does lead to those 3 post-secondary goal areas, looking at what type of career does that student want to be engaged in, that employment piece. Then looking at what type of education or training, in addition to what that student has been able to acquire in high school, is needed for that student to be successful in their chosen career area for employment. And then also looking at, in context, how is that student going to be engaged and live as independently as possible in their community. So again, that information regarding what are those 3 post-secondary goals areas regarding further training, employment, and independent living really should be based on good assessment done with that student, engaging the family, and engaging those folks that know that student best. In looking at then for that IEP year, supporting that student, then looking at what are those activities and services that that student is going to be engaged in that are going to move them towards those goals. Transition, when you look at IDEA, is really this driven process that's leading to those outcomes. And then their classes that they're taking or their courses of study that those students are engaged with should, again, be leading them to those post-secondary goals that they have. So looking at, not only the academic skill areas, so what is that student working on in reading, in written expression or communication needs, in math areas, as well as looking at those functional skill areas. What are we doing to support these young folks to reach those post-secondary goals? And then also looking at what are the coordinated services that are being provided with our adult agencies from the education stand? So how are our VR agency staff that are working directly with the schools supporting the students with complex needs as we look at those 5 priority pre-ETS areas, the pre-employment transition areas? How is that occurring in your school system? What's happening during the school day? What's happening outside of school and supporting them? How are other agency staff engaged in this process? How, in addition to including the VR staff in IEP meetings, are we including agency staff from our mental health systems, from our intellectual disability systems, as well as other agencies that support our students with disabilities? And then lastly, but not least, looking at the IEP goals for our students, based again on assessment, on 1, looking at what are that student's goals for the future, and then taking a step back and seeing what they need to work on in order to be successful to meet those needs. So again, I think this slide does a nice job of highlighting those areas, and it is a process that's in place for all students that have disabilities. But I think when we look at this, it's important that we're following the same process for our students with complex needs. The next slide that I want to look at goes into a little bit more detail regarding this effective transition planning process. And again, as I mentioned, it's taking some time and really looking at the interests and preferences that that student has. So this might require, for a student that has more complex needs, really looking at engagement in a person-centered planning process. And we're going to talk a little bit more in this presentation about life course, but you may be using some other type of person-centered planning process like maps or paths to obtain information on where is that student, what are their interests and preferences, what do they want to do once they graduate from high school and they're living in their communities. So again, this assessment process, looking at what their interests are, what they prefer to do, and then looking at, if you look at the arrows, going down and seeing where is that student currently functioning, what are their abilities, what are their skills, and how does that align with what their interests and preferences in doing in the future. I mentioned before, really looking at then what types of accommodations, supports, assistive technology could be utilized to support that student in being successful once they graduate. And I think oftentimes thinking beyond, as Kim had mentioned earlier in the webinar, thinking beyond the folding and flowers and filth types of jobs that traditionally we may be thinking about for a student with complex needs, and really looking at what they're interested in doing and what supports can be given in order to support them, rather than just discrediting, no, they're not going to be able to do a particular career area. In transition kind of language, when we look at what that student's goals are for once they leave school and look at where they're currently functioning, is sometimes called a gap analysis. And basically what that's talking about is looking at what that student wants to do once they leave school. So say, for example, the student is really interested into going into a career in helping in the helping profession and working in the medical field. In looking at that particular area, maybe the student, because they have a lot of medical issues, have really been connected to their doctors and nurses, and they really would like to explore a career area in that field. When looking at where they are currently functioning regarding their academic and functional abilities, perhaps that is not the most obtainable goal, to be a doctor, for example. But then taking a step back and looking at, well, then in that career cluster area, what type of jobs could that student do in the medical field that they can, given their strengths as well as their needs in assistive technology, to be successful. So really kind of taking that into consideration. This piece of assessment, too, and I think it should be noted, is something that should be ongoing. So when the student is entering transition, and again, depending on your state's regulations, whether that's at 14 or 16, that this is an ongoing process, that we're continuing to look at how that student is doing, what progress they are making on their IEP goals regarding both their academic and functional areas, and where that student still is regarding their interests and preferences for once they leave school. All of those, taken into account, are really, really important. As we continue on, I do want to remind folks, if you do have any questions, please post those in the Q&A piece. We are trying to, keep track of those as we move on. So in the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the materials that are out there to help support students and their families in this process. On this slide, we're talking about some of the resources that are available through the Zaro Center and the Center for Learning and Leadership out of the Oklahoma University. And the link that is provided on this slide will take you directly to the PDF of the Child Preference Indicator, the Personal Preference Indicator, and the Employment Support Indicator. And while these materials are a little bit dated, they really do provide valuable information in looking at the assessment of where is that young person, where are they regarding functional areas as well as some academic areas, and kind of helping in what we were talking about before a few minutes ago, that assessment process, seeing what that student needs to work on to be as successful as possible as they prepare to graduate from high school and live as independently as possible in their communities. So on the next slide, what we're talking about is looking at specifically the employment support indicator. And this is just a snapshot that is coming out of that employment support indicator from the Centers for Learning and Leadership. But these are some of the things that it's looking at. How that student is able to do as far as attention to tasks, what their endurance rate is like. So as the student is involved in community-based experiences, these are all considerations to think about. I think it's also important in planning, and we mentioned this before, but the engagement and input from families as well as those that know that individual student the best really need to be considered and need to be part of that planning process of information that's gathered in support of the IEP meeting as well as the IEPE meeting as well as the individual support planning meeting. And I mention all three of those to just kind of reiterate again the fact that, especially for a student with complex needs, this is really a team effort of all of the professionals that are working with that young person and their family. So oftentimes that is going to involve not only the education system and the VR system, but also the mental health system and the intellectual disability system. And I think that collaboration point is really important to make. Back in the day when I was a transition coordinator, I could remember working and having the IEP meetings. Then, the next day or later that same day, the VR counselor would be in and they would be working with that family on the IPE planning process and talking about vocational goals. And another day, the intellectual disabilities, the supports coordinator would be working on this support plan for the student. And oftentimes those goals were not the same goals. So how can we do a better job of coordinating this? The way I always would look at that, it's one individual, one student, and what are those primary areas or goals of importance that young person needs to work on. So when we're looking at some of these resources, it's important to get that information from a variety of environments and perspectives to really best support that young person that we're working with. The next slide that we have is looking at another type of information gathering assessment resource, and this is actually this assistive technology protocol for training. And this particular slide is, again, looking more specifically at communication needs. And this is probably one of the primary areas, especially when we're talking about students with complex needs being successful once they graduate from school to go on for further training, employment, to live independently in their community, is how are they communicating and how are they able to communicate their wants, their needs, their interests. So really looking at effective communication strategies is so important. I think it's also important to consider what has been tried in the past and maybe has not worked regarding communication needs and what could be tried. But again, that gets back to really effective documentation and coordination of information. So if we're looking at an IEP, for example, when we look at present ed levels, they really should be well detailed. We should have really good information in there on what has proven to be effective, but equally what has proven not to be effective in supporting that young person's success, in this case around communication needs. And then looking at goals to support that for that student to be successful. Another piece, I think, to consider when we're talking about effective practices, strategies, activities, and services for students is really to look at those community-based and work-based learning experiences that the student can be engaged with. These experiences do not start early enough, and I think it's important, and this was in the chat box, several folks have made this comment, that really setting high expectations are so important. And as many experiences that young person can have are so valuable. Back again when I was a transition coordinator, one of the things that I coordinated with the families and the students I was working with were volunteer opportunities in the community for all the students to be engaged with. We did these not necessarily during the school day, they were on weekends and evenings, and we picked one activity a month, and we actually, I was able to coordinate this with an organization in our community that offered volunteer opportunities for anybody that was interested. So these opportunities would vary from month to month, things such as volunteering in a food bank, to working outside, helping in a city park, to looking at rehabbing of medical equipment, just to name some examples. It was interesting because I ran into, actually a couple of years ago, a former student that I had and his mom. And his mom's comment was that having her son at one of the volunteer experiences was so eye-opening because she never thought that he would be able to work or being able to be really competent in an employment setting. And seeing him working in his volunteer site really opened her eyes to the skills that this young man had and how successful he could be. So I think really looking at that exposure early to community-based experiences, whether this is the school that is helping to do this or the family or a combination, and then looking at our interagency collaborators, it's really important to expose young folks to these experiences as part of their educational experience. I think it's important to really looking at, as that young person is involved in these experiences too, is to document how they do in those situations. Looking at the conditions that are enabling their success, looking at how that individual learns best, what strategies are in place, also having an understanding of what doesn't work. So we're not setting up that young person for failure. There was a young man that I worked at with somewhat significant disabilities on the autism spectrum, and he had an issue with tactile issues of clothing and only able to wear certain things. And we had a placement that was in a food service area where you had to wear a uniform. And we got to that particular site, and the young person was there, and as soon as we got there, he started to take off his uniform because he really, that was an issue. And I think back to that because that was really on my part. I should have, as the teacher, the transition person, been much more aware of that need and not have put that individual in that situation. The other thing I wanted to mention, again, or to reiterate, that this information that we're obtaining from these community-based work and learning experiences, that we're taking that information and documenting it, that all of that be considered as assessment information and help influence the various plans that we're writing for our students. With that, we're going to move on and talk a little bit next about what are some effective practices that support the transition of students with the most complex needs. So on this slide, these are some suggestions, and really these suggestions come from a variety of sources. These are suggestions both from the education systems, but also the VR systems, as well as the mental health and developmental disability systems. So first of all, really looking at the services are driven by what the student needs. And I don't think we can emphasize this enough, that it really is an individualized process that we are talking about. I think that became real evident in the chat box from one of the very first slides of today's webinar when we asked, who do you consider an individual with the most complex needs? And depending on really what those most complex or multiple needs that that young person has, should then drive what supports, what activities, what services we are providing for those students. It's also important to think about the activities that we are engaging with that student. So if they're pre-ETS activities, if they are services and activities that the school is engaging with, if they build over time, and it's not a once and done type of exposure for that student. Again, starting as early as possible, and then building upon those, and evaluating what has worked and what has not worked, and what we could try differently to support them. We mentioned about the understanding of the needs that that student has, and being able to communicate those needs to the folks that are all working with that young person, so that there's a clear understanding between the educational professionals about what works and what doesn't work. And again, that sometimes I think we get so locked into our own areas or silos, even within a system. So for example, in the education system, is the occupational therapist communicating with the physical therapist, with the speech-language staff, with the classroom teacher? Is there a discussion on what works, what doesn't work, what's successful? And really there should not be, and unfortunately I still sometimes see this in IEPs, where the student may have an occupational therapy goal that's only done with the occupational therapist in their setting, in that classroom, and it's not something that's incorporated in the student's classroom for his academic or functional skills or in the community. And I guess the point that I'm getting here with is that those goals should be integrated, and they should be something that's done on a consistent basis in all the environments that that student is working in. We should be, as I mentioned before, really looking at this as a multi-pronged approach. Oftentimes this comes up with, how is we going to support this? One system can't do this alone, and I think that's a really important point to make. One system really can't do this alone. These students that we're talking about really do have complex support needs. So looking at ways to grade funding, looking at ways to share support, looking at ways not to duplicate support too, I think is another important issue. That if, for example, the student is working on transportation, travel training within the school, that is noted, and that's not something then that is also going to be repeated by the developmental disability system, the supports coordinators working with that student, or the VR system. That we're working really in a smarter way. And last but not least, really looking at strong family engagement, making sure that there are those discussions with the family, the engagement of the family. One of the things, again, that I used to do with the families that I worked with as a transition coordinator was every year I sent home a family survey of information on how that student was doing, what their strengths, their needs were, how they were doing at home, as well as getting the same information from the student and then from the professionals working with them. All of that information, before I looked at developing an IEP, I would look at, and that really helped to guide not only the transition planning process and looking at what their post-secondary goals were, but also looking at their annual IEP goals. I think that was really, really a valuable activity. Along with that, we also would suggest to families to look at possible goals that they could be helping to implement over the course of the year, the IEP year, with their sons or daughters at home. This next slide is looking at some additional effective practices, strategies, and the first bullet there is looking at making sure that we're connecting families, the young folks, with an understanding of benefits planning, what resources are available to help that young person to be successful, and also the fact that if the student is engaged in competitive integrated employment, how that will affect possibly their benefits, but also I think what supports are available. It's important, I think, as the transition coordinator, the transition staff in education, or the VR counselor, or the supports coordinators, to really have a good understanding of what resources are available in our communities, including the supports that are available for benefits planning. Looking at information Kim had mentioned at the start of the hour about the Promise Center, what types of strategies and resources were developed to support families, especially around the issues of students receiving Social Security benefits. The idea of really strong employer engagement. Someone had mentioned in the chat box a short while ago that it's really important for employers to realize that students can really provide benefit to their businesses, and that given them the opportunity, they can be really successful. There is a strong push for customized employment, looking at the discovery process, and looking, I think, especially for students with complex needs, that that's a consideration in our planning process. We're looking at those strategies. I think also looking at kind of thinking somewhat outside of the box of how we can best showcase and support the students with complex needs. So, for example, looking at perhaps a video resume to really showcase their talent. Oftentimes when you're looking at a student with complex needs and you just look at what is written on paper, that doesn't really look like a student that would be a valuable asset to a business, but really highlighting their strengths, their interests, and what their abilities are in a video, for example, of what they're able to do could really then look to a nice customized employment type of position. And then really looking at this issue of who is supporting all this and how best to support that student in the classroom, in the community. And I think from a system-wide or systemic issue, looking at how best to allocate resources and how best to integrate the supports and services that exist between not only the education system, but I think all of our systems that we are engaged with. This next piece, I want to talk a little bit about Life Course and the Life Course framework. And the Life Course framework is something that was developed several years ago out of the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And it is a process that is being utilized in many states. And it is a person-centered planning, person-centered directed planning approach. On this slide and the next slide, it highlights those areas that the Life Course framework looks at. So we're looking at things such as daily life and employment types of areas, those issues surrounding community living and where that young person wants to live once they graduate from high school, looking at social and areas around spirituality regarding that young person, looking at health and safety issues, as well as looking at citizen and advocacy issues. The Life Course framework does a really nice job of outlining these, really looking at kind of aligning really to that IEP process when we were talking about assessment. Really looking at what are those future goals that that student has regarding going on and living in the community independently, looking at what their goals are as far as employment and any additional training or supports they may need, and then taking a step back and looking at these 6 areas and addressing those more specifically. In the Life Course framework, as we look at our next slide, it's looking at what is that ideal life that that person would like to have. And on this particular slide, this is an example of that, where the family is really looking at, if you look at the little purple box, wanting to have friends and family and enough money, a job they like, a home that they can have of their own, being involved in their spirituality of choice, going on vacations, making sure that their health needs are considered. But then also looking at what that young person does not want, or what are negative influences for them. On this slide, you'll see 2 links that link directly to Life Course and information for families regarding the Life Course process. Any of the person-centered planning strategies, including Life Course, are a complex process. It's not something that you will be able to do in an hour and be done, but it really does bring together the folks that know that young person best, as well as engaging that young person in this process to discuss what their goals are for the future and where they currently are regarding their strengths and needs, as well as how best to support them. This next slide looks at an example of Ben and kind of gives you an idea of really looking at all those areas that are helpful in planning for the future. So I know it's a little tight to see, but it's really looking at what are those past experiences that, in this example, Ben had. What has he been able to engage with? What are some of those concerns that the young person has, that Ben has? Looking at possible future life experiences, and then that vision for where the young person sees themselves after they graduate from high school and how that can be supported. Then it looks at, the settings that would be best, but then in the gray box, what are things that really need to be considered so that young person is being successful without having those things that are detriments to them, harming that process, so they can be successful as possible. So again, if you have any questions, please type those in. I know I'm going to now turn this over to Kim, who's going to talk about some next step strategies. So Kim, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. A lot of information, guys, in a full hour and a half, and we're about 9 minutes left, and so we appreciate there's still 137 of you on with us, so we're going to wrap it up here. Love the example of Ben's life trajectory. Love these one-page profiles. They say so much about the individual, what's important to them, what's important for them, what they like, what they don't like. I think we need these on all of our spouses, siblings, parents, and colleagues. But seriously, these are instrumental in helping to guide a team. And this is a great way, how I mentioned earlier, we've got to get the voice of the student and youth into the decisions that we're making. And this is a fantastic way of doing that. So think of Ben and think of, you know, what are some of the things he's interested in? What are some of the things he doesn't want? He doesn't want to live a life of poverty. He doesn't want to be lonely. He doesn't want to have poor health. He doesn't want to have a guardian. He does not want to be segregated or live in an institution, and he doesn't want to be staying at home. So we consider those things and we think, okay, how can we help Ben? And none of us know Ben right now, but how can we help him become as independent as possible, knowing that there's different levels of guardianship or, you know, whatever, you know, people who can just do the financial piece or people who help make medical decisions. You know, there's certain degrees of guardianship as well. So we've got to consider that whole picture when we're making decisions as providers, as teachers, as parents in helping our students and youth with disabilities. So in going to the next slide, you know, what's next? With all the information that you've heard over the last hour and a half, ultimately, you can see how critical it is that we've had this collaboration between agencies, not just agencies, families, other community supports that the students and youth might be involved in. Find out who in your state is actually trained to conduct person-centered planning, and find out where those meetings are taking place and see if you can go to train-the-trainer events or have them come in and train you all. Select the different transition assessments. There's a wealth of them out there. Everything from free online, free paper to, you know, really expensive and everything in between. There's a variety to be implemented based on students' abilities, and if we're looking at something that's academic focused versus functional focus versus independent living. You saw the great assessment on assistive technology. There's a wide variety out there. We can't just use Casey Life Skills for everybody. We can't just say that the Explore and the Plan are enough. It's not getting to the strengths and needs of that individual person. And think about the whole student and how to provide experiences that help feed that whole student, for lack of a better word. How can we look at everything that's going to help that person be successful that day after high school, to help them when they don't have a teacher who's going to be there every day for them to help them make decisions and navigate the world, who ultimately one day we hope will live and work independently. And consider how you are receiving information about and how you're communicating information about your students with significant disabilities. We have to be both receivers and communicators. We have to share the information. IDEA requires transition assessments to be conducted. Let's share those results with the team that's working for that student. Voc Rehab, you do vocational evaluations and other assessments. Let's use those results and bring them back to that team. Let's compare notes and see if we see unity or if we see things that are inconsistent and come back to the drawing board for it. And I know those kiddos the best. Then begin the transition process early. And like we said earlier, wait till the junior or senior year. What federal law says, it says it must place upon an IDEA or, you know, anytime earlier if you choose to do so. When you talk about individuals with significant needs, the most significant needs, we can't wait. We've got to start that process earlier because for many of them, independent living is not going to be just optional. It's going to be critical. That may be one of the most important things So talk with your teams. Find out ways to start transition as early as you can. Don't wait till it's too late and they're almost out that high school door. And really think about, what do you hope for your students? What do you hope for your own children? What did your parents hope for you? Let's expand our goals to beyond the school doors and to beyond just a work environment, to the community at large and full inclusion. It's all about collaboration, shared responsibility, and getting all voices at the table and hearing them. And I'll go back to that, how can we do it? Through education, through training, and through demonstration. What Michael and I tried to do for you is include a lot of resources for you. So when if you did download the PowerPoint, you have access to it already. If you're going to wait until you get an email after the fact, you'll have it as well, a link where you can download the PowerPoint. But here are several resources with the active links that will take you right to those sources so you can see what's available to you. On the next slide as well, other programs and resources for you. And then finally, just saying, do you have any questions for us? Is there more information that you would like on this topic? Because in the future, I'd like to see us do a deeper dive into this, where we're actually attacking some of those barriers and coming up with solutions, having you share from across the country. What are things that you do to overcome that obstacle of transportation or low expectations or uninformed businesses? So, if you want to put them in the chat box, you can. You want to ask questions, you can. We would welcome it. And I just want to remind everybody before people start logging off, because I see we're down to 124 right now, we do have an evaluation that we would love for you to fill out while this is fresh on your mind. It's so easy to do. You'll have an active link. We wanted you to learn about evidence-based practices. We wanted you to feel empowered, and we want you to walk away and collaborate with your teams. If we communicated those things to you well, then please let it reflect in that evaluation of this webinar. And lastly, I want to share with you that we have our third webinar in this 4-part series that's coming up next week on the 26th. And it's going to focus on supporting and serving youth in the foster care system. We have 2 phenomenal speakers, Krista Esquivel and JC Farkas, that will be leading that for us. And you can register for that free webinar. Please share with others. And if you would like to contact myself or Michael, our information is on this last slide, the contact slide for the webinar. So Michael, if you don't have any other information, and Sylvie, I don't know if you have any final messages to our participants. I would say
nope, you can go ahead, Kim, and close out.
Okay. Well, thank you all again. We appreciate the input you all gave through the polls and through the chats and questions. And we look forward to possibly having you on a future webinar and to see what results come on the survey so we can plan more for the future. Thank you all so much and have a great day.